Hey, so in my house, every single night at our dinner table, we do this thing and we call it a morning meeting, which is, if you're following, that doesn't really make much sense to do a morning meeting at night. But what's actually happening here is that my 5-year-old daughter, when she's in kindergarten, they would do a morning meeting every day to get their day started. So they would sit down as a class in a circle and they would all check in to see how the day went, and then they would ask a fun question, what we call as adults icebreakers. And the kids just don't know that yet. They think it's just funny. So Afton has started leading our family in this kind of exercise every single night. We actually had to set up a schedule because she gets really mad sometimes when she's not the one leading it. But we will always kind of check in about the day. And then a fun question that we recently asked our whole family is, hey, what's your favorite holiday? And my wife, Megan, was like, immediately. She was like, I know exactly what my favorite holiday is, and it's Thanksgiving. So it's, for her and for Megan, it's something about like the food and the gathering together around a table and eating together. It's got this like nostalgic feel to it. And what I actually think is that Megan's onto something here. Being together with food for a purpose is a pretty special thing in our culture. And it really does something more than just kind of fill us up for what we're doing. Does that resonate with anybody here? You can probably remember to like really fun meals that you've had in your life. They kind of just stick with you. And I'm going to actually contend today that that's a huge part of our faith as well when we kind of seek to follow Jesus. And the meal that we're going to look at today is this thing called the Lord's Supper. So right up here on these tables, this is what we're going to be talking about. And sometimes this is called the Eucharist. Some people call it communion. Other times it's what's referred to the body and the bread. And there's a bunch of different ways to approach this topic, to speak about it. And really kind of you can categorize yourself on where you land on this topic as well. And I would actually say you probably learn a lot about a person by how they actually approach this. If you kind of just like, hey, tell me what you think about this, you could probably understand something about a person's background. You could understand what type of churches they've been in. There's tons of different things. And this has been a contentious topic throughout history as well. Many people have died just because they were so adamantly they were like, this is what I believe. And they were like, we're going to kill you if you don't change your belief. And they were like, great, kill me. So people really believe this with a lot of heart in it. And it's a pretty popular topic. And it really kind of interacts with all churches around us. So, and I'll admit that I think questions like this, coming from someone who hasn't been in a church in their life, kind of like, what is the Lord's Supper? Why do you do that? Why do you eat this gross little wafer thing at the end of the service? Nobody thinks that's good. And then you drink grape juice out of it. Like, what is that? Those are like actually really good questions to ask. And what I think is there's probably also people inside the church as well that are probably asking the same exact questions. It can feel a little bit bizarre or strange that we end a service the same exact way every week. So our goal today is just really take a deep look at what this meal is. And I want to say, I think you should be pretty excited about this. Well, this meal is often misunderstood. I think it's actually one of the things about Christianity that's really cool. Really, really cool. Sometimes it's hard to talk about aspects of our faith in a place like Denver. It's not always received well, but I think after today, you'll be like, I could literally talk about that with anybody, and they would be interested in Christianity. And so many of the things that we do in our own culture that are really popular right now are actually derived from religious practices, just like this one. So you can kind of pay attention to that as well. So here's how we're going to do this today. The very first thing we're going to do is I actually want to look back in history, because to understand this meal, you actually have to look back to the very beginning of the Bible. And once we do that, we're going to zoom in, secondly, on the text that we read today, that Shelby just read for us. And we're going to look at exactly what it is that Jesus is doing. And then the third and final thing that we're going to do is we're going to look into the future and see what this means. So if you are an English major, I just said all three tenses right there. We're going to look at the past, kind of the present, and the future of this meal, okay? So I want to jump right back into this text. Let's pick this up again in Mark 14, verse 12. And it says, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, Where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover? Okay, I can tend to nerd out on some stuff like this. And when I first became a Christian, I'll fully admit, I would read a text like this and I would have no clue what they were talking about. Like I didn't know what unleavened meant until COVID and everybody started baking sourdough bread, and then now I know what it is. But it seemed to me that we were like celebrating some flatbread, and there was like this special species of lamb called a Passover lamb that I had never heard of. And I don't know why we use the language of sacrifice and not slaughter. That was all, I'm being genuinely honest, I didn't understand any of that when I was like first kind of around church. And to get a full picture of what's actually happening here, this is what you have to do. You have to actually look back in history and see what this meal was and how it got there. So, the story that I want you to think back to is the story of Moses. We've probably heard about Moses, right? You guys have all watched the cartoon, The Prince of Egypt, with Val Kilmer playing Moses. I remember it terrified me when I was little, when the sea split and there was a big shark there. I was like, wow, this is crazy. So, or maybe anybody seen any Broadway play fans in here? Joseph. Anyways, this whole story kind of sticks in line. I'll come back to that. Don't worry about that part. So this book of Genesis, the book of Genesis is the very first book in the Bible. And it's the story of God actually choosing one family that's eventually going to culminate in Jesus. And God has chosen this family. He's kind of saying, hey, through you, I'm actually going to end up saving the world. You're going to be the vessel in which I use to save the world. This is kind of the story of Genesis. And really what happens is this family doesn't actually end up in the spot that they thought they were going to end up in. When God says, hey, I'm going to use you to save the world, you kind of expect things to go really well. I would, at least. And that's not actually how things end up. So what you see is you have Abraham. He's kind of the first patriarch of this family that God has chosen, and his wife, Sarah. They get a promise that they're going to bear children, and their children's children are eventually going to outnumber the stars. It's quite a promise to say, like, you're talking generations and generations of protection and provision. And through this promise, Abraham has a son whose name is Isaac. And Isaac has a son, and his name is Jacob. And eventually, Jacob has a son, he has a bunch of sons, but one of those sons' name is Joseph. He's also pretty popular. So I was talking about a Broadway play. Anybody ever see Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat on Broadway? So he's a popular guy. He was popular in his time and our time too. So by the time we get to Joseph, it actually seems that everything is working out for this family, that God has said, I'm going to use you to save the world. By the time we get to Joseph, he's essentially calling the shots in Egypt. Pharaoh's really not calling the shots anymore. It's Joseph, because Pharaoh just uses Joseph to make decisions because Joseph is just always right, is how it kind of seems. And not only does Joseph end up saving Egypt, but he also ends up saving his own family. And in the end, Joseph and his family get the very best land that Egypt has to offer, which is pretty cool. And interestingly, all of this happens because Joseph's brothers didn't like him. They didn't like how kind of popular he was with his dad. So they sell him off into slavery, and then they lie to their dad, and they say that he was murdered by a wild beast in the field, and they take his coat, and they dip it in blood, and they take it back to the dad, and they're like, see, he was killed by a lion. And then dad's upset. But really, Joseph is just kind of on his own path in Egypt. So you keep moving through this story. That's how the book of Genesis ends. And then you get into the second book of the Bible, which is called Exodus. And in the very first page, you realize that things have actually changed for this family. It's not what it was anymore. You actually see this language here that says the Pharaoh that was there, he did not know Joseph anymore. So what you kind of get is a picture of there's been some time removed, and this new Pharaoh has no affinity for this family that God has now chosen. And since there's so many of Joseph's family members, remember, they were going to outnumber the stars. They're growing very rapidly inside of Egypt. The new Pharaoh kind of sees this group of people as a threat. And what do evil rulers usually do when there's a different ethnicity or group of people who pose a threat? They usually start to justify some type of genocide. Like, this is not just a story of the Bible. This is actually the story of human history. And see this exactly. We see this play out in the book of Exodus. The new Pharaoh is actually going to issue a decree, and he's going to tell all the midwives in his land that when these people, this family of God, have babies, if it's a male, we want you to kill it. It's a wild story. And through a series of events, there's this one male baby who's born, whose name is Moses, and he kind of goes through this like spy story thing, and he eventually gets adopted into the family of Pharaoh himself. So it's like, it really backfires on Pharaoh when he does this. And we see this, that Moses grows up inside of Pharaoh's home. And he establishes himself as a leader in Egypt and as a leader of his own people, that same family that God said he was going to save the world through. And Moses, what he does is he eventually starts telling Pharaoh, hey, God has commanded you that you actually need to let my people go. And Pharaoh says, no, not going to happen. So the kicker, though, to the story is that Moses really kind of has God on his side, and Pharaoh is making the lives of these Israelites, this family of God, just really pretty terrible. And God, what he does is he starts kind of sending warnings to Pharaoh and the nation of Egypt, and we get all sorts of crazy things, like we get water turning to blood, we get plagues and infestations and illnesses and crazy weather events, and eventually what happens is that God tells Pharaoh, who's kind of the bad guy in the story, he's like, hey, you remember that thing that you did to my people? When you actually killed the firstborn males of every family that's mine? If you do not let my people go, I'm actually going to return that gift back to you. That's what God tells Pharaoh, kind of through Moses. And Pharaoh, what he does is he refuses to listen, and that very night, God warns his people about what's coming. So I want to look back in the Bible just for a second here. We're going to look at Exodus chapter 12. And as we read this, it should be up on the screen. We're going to read verses 3 through 13. And I paraphrased some of this. I left out parts that didn't matter, but you'll see I kind of jump around from like 3 to 6 to 9 or something like that. So, but I really, as we read this today, I want you to listen to some of the language that's going to show up here in Exodus, because it's the same exact language that's going to get used in the Gospel of Mark as well. So, in Exodus chapter 12, I'm gonna start here. It says, "The Lord said to Moses in the land of Egypt, tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb and shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they eat the lamb. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on a fire. With unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat it. In this manner you shall eat it. With your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I'm the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you. And on the houses where you are, when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you or destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." So that's what God tells Pharaoh. He's like, I'm giving you back the same exact thing that you gave to my people if you don't listen to me. And it happens. It comes to pass. And immediately what it does is it breaks the nation of Egypt. And the Israelites now have to flee from this genocidal country, and they're on the run towards their freedom. Like, can you imagine the intensity of that for God's people? Like, you've been oppressed for generation after generation, and God just showed up and killed the firstborn male of every household of that nation. You think they're going to take that well? How would they respond in that moment? And you're on the run. Like, put yourself in that in those shoes. That's an interesting spot to be in. Like, can you imagine the fear that they probably felt in that moment? So as they're on the run, they eventually make it through a series of events, which we're not going to get into. We just don't have time to. But what happens on this very first night when God establishes what's about to happen to the nation of Egypt, God uses this event in his protection of his people. And God says, hey, I want you to memorialize this, and I want you to remember it so that my people, this family that I've chosen to save the world through, will never, ever, ever forget the work that I did for them. And you know how God does that? He uses food and a feast. So God actually establishes a feast that his people should do once a year for the rest of their existence. It's kind of how this works. And just like in our culture, food actually means something to us. Like you cook a specific food on Christmas. If I said, what's on the menu for 4th of July, everybody would probably give me the same 5 things. We do the same thing. We use food to memorialize events and memories in our culture as well. There's a long-standing tradition of doing this. And this is exactly the gift that God's going to give his people, and this is the meal that the Israelites celebrated once a year, and it was called Passover because God passed over their houses when he was going through and kind of executing his judgment on the nation of Egypt. That's where we get the name Passover. So let's get back into our story today. Kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And in Mark, we see that the disciples asked Jesus, they're kind of like, hey, in the very first verse, hey, it's Passover. It's like, this is the night of the festival. Where are we going to go and like prepare this meal? So Jesus, in this kind of like Sherlock Holmes moment, if you ever watch Sherlock Holmes, it's like everything's kind of predetermined at the end of the episode and everything kind of falls into place exactly like Sherlock Holmes wanted it to happen. It's kind of exactly what Jesus does in this moment. Jesus kind of sends them off into the city and he gives them like a little bit of a clue and a direction. So pay attention to this. Here we go. And let's pick this back up in verse 13, starting in the Gospel of Mark. And he, Jesus, sent 2 of his disciples, and he said to them, go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. And wherever he enters, say to the master of the house, the teacher says, where's my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large upper room, furnished and ready. There prepare for us. And the disciples set out and went into the city and found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. It's kind of a funny little thing to think about. Jesus, I guess, has like snuck into the city and talked to all these people and paid people off, and somehow they have a secret room in this house to go celebrate this meal. It's like Jesus knew what he was doing. So what we have here is Jesus with his disciples preparing to celebrate the Exodus, which was the exodus of God's people from Egypt, and they're going to do it with a Passover meal. And that word Exodus, which is the name of the second book of the Bible, it literally means it's a departure of a large group of people from a certain place. So the Israelites were on their exodus away from Egypt. That's where we get the name of the book, for the book of Exodus. So that's about the quickest survey that we could possibly do up to this point in the Bible. And what I want to do next is kind of shift what we're doing. And I want to zoom into this present moment around what Jesus is actually doing in this upper room with his disciples. So at a Passover meal, which Jesus is leading with his disciples, remember this is done to remember and celebrate the Exodus. I've never done a Passover meal. Has anybody in here ever done like a proper Passover meal? A few of us. Good for you. I'm going to plan one this year with my kids. I feel like this is a special thing that I've kind of just like missed out on, and it sounds really fun to me. But if you do one, a meal sort of goes like this. Maybe some of you could correct me after this. But one, you actually have to, it's a costume party. You actually have to show up to this dinner dressed in a specific way. Did anybody pick that out in the text that we read? It said, in this manner you shall eat it, from Exodus chapter 12. It says, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and a staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. So they literally had to wear certain clothes to go to this meal. And why would they dress that way? It was because they had to be ready to be on the move. If you were in Denver, you would need to wear like your hiking boots and a Patagonia down jacket, and can't wear cotton. That's the silent killer in Colorado. You'd bring your trekking poles and like a big backpack loaded full of stuff. And you would eat dinner with that on the whole time. because you're remembering that you were about to be on the move. There's no like time to hang out after this meal and chit chat. So the Israelites, when they're under this leadership of Moses, they're about to just be on the run. So their clothes actually are reminding them of something even in this moment. The second thing that you often did at a Passover meal is you drink wine. And surprisingly, this surprised me when I learned this, you drink quite a bit of it. This meal would actually move through 4 cups of wine from like kind of the beginning to end. And if you're like, man, that feels like a lot of wine, you're like, yeah, it is. It's just a lot of wine. So you do this, and every single cup that you drink through this meal, it actually represents something different. It represents themes and like the protection of God. And the reason that you choose wine is, what does wine actually look like? It looks like blood. It's the same color. And what this wine would do is that it would actually represent the lamb's death, the lamb that had to die so that the Israelites could paint the blood over their doorposts and God would pass over. And nobody would die inside of that house. So, and finally, the third thing that a Passover meal has is all sorts of food. And this is really actually pretty interesting. So a Passover meal, we said it has clothes that you wear, and it's got wine. And then the food that you do is this first thing that's called unleavened bread. And you probably picked that up in the text. This is during the feast of unleavened bread. And the reason that you would eat unleavened bread at this meal is the same reason that you wore the clothes that you wore to that meal. You had to show up to this meal ready to move, which meant you also didn't have time to let your bread rise during this. So what you had to do was actually eat flatbread. Normally you would make some dough, it would sit for a few hours, and it would become more delicious and fluffy. They didn't have the chance to do that. They had to cook it and eat it knowing they were going to be on the move in just a few hours. So a Passover has wine, it has unleavened bread, and then it also has this thing called bitter herbs. And this isn't some like bitter leafy green with like a slightly off pH level. It's kind of like a bit unpleasant to eat. What you would actually do, this is funny, I think I would laugh at my friends while we did this part, but what you would actually do is you would take like an olive-sized bite of ground up horseradish. So if you've ever had like too much wasabi on a piece of sushi, you know exactly the feeling that I'm talking about. And you do this in the midst of the meal for exactly that to happen. I always laugh at my friends when they're kind of like in slight discomfort. So I think we'd all have a good time laughing at each other. But everyone at the table ends up taking a bite of this bitter herb at the same time. And do you know what everybody starts to do? Everybody cries. It's like an inevitable response that your body has. You could just imagine everybody's like, what in the world is going on right now? And the reason that you eat this bitter herb is, again, it is done in an act of remembrance. And it means something. In the book of Exodus, it's recalled in the very first chapter, in Exodus chapter 1, that the Egyptians, the whole nation, made the lives of God's people bitter. And they made it bitter with hard service, they made it bitter with slavery, and they made it bitter with oppression and genocide. So this small act, which is kind of like taken through the mouth and then expressed throughout the entire body, is exactly what it sounds like. It's an act to remind the participant at that moment what it was actually like to be in Israel and be a slave. It's unavoidable that you're going to feel pain and it's going to make you cry. It's actually so that you can show your children, in a sense, what it was like for the older generations to have to live this way. So, and you guys know what I'm talking about? You've like taken like a wasabi shot to the brain while you're eating sushi before? Those of you who are chuckling, I can tell you've done this. So that's the bitter herb. So Passover meal's got wine, unleavened bread, it's got bitter herbs, and the very last thing that it has is a large portion of roasted meat. This is the culmination of the meal, and this part is also to remember the lamb that died again. And this is, again, sounds fun to me. This lamb died, so it was the one that could actually provide the blood to go over the doorpost of the house. And the Israelites here, they actually feast on the lamb. It's not like they just killed it and like threw it out in the yard and it rotted there. It actually became a meal for them. I was joking this week, and I was like, this might be the first farm-to-table meal that's ever been recorded in history. So Denverites, we're kind of like just trying to get back to this exact thing. We pay really good money to get a proper farm-to-table meal. And here they are, they're doing it once a year, and it's just like a normal part of their practice. We're still debating here around like what meat is in our Taco Bell tacos. We don't really know. And God actually gives the command that these people should actually take this animal from their farm and actually lives with them for a few days. Can you imagine all the kids? They'd be like naming it. And then it would be their friend, and then they all have to eat it together. But this lamb, though, was actually meant to be enjoyed in the company of others and remembrance again of God's protection through a sacrifice. So that's the meal that Jesus' disciples are preparing at this moment in the Gospel of Mark. Does that sound like a good time to you guys? I think it would be really fun. You see, Christianity is actually a faith that is not something that just like lives in our head. It's actually something that like involves our bodies. It involves all aspects of our being. It's like our mind and our stomachs and our souls and our spirits. All of us. I just like love that. I think it's fun. It's more than we sometimes kind of let Christianity be, in a sense. So let's jump back into our story. Let's pick this up back again in verse 17. And things are just going to continue to get more interesting. And what Jesus is going to do here is this Passover meal is something that has actually been celebrated the same way for something like 1,500 years at this point. It's got a pretty like structured rhythm that you follow. And watch what Jesus does to a structured rhythm here. So let's look again at our text. We can pick this back up in verse 17. And it says, "And when it was evening, he came with the 12. And as they were reclining at the table and eating, Jesus said, 'Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me.' And they began to be sorrowful and say to him one after another, 'Is it I?' And he said to them, 'It is one of the 12 who is dipping bread into the dish with me. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better if that man had not been born.'" It's a pretty intense word. So if you remember, this meal has a specific rhythm. It's got a meaning and an order that it's supposed to follow. And Jesus, what he does is he just like interjects something else into this. Like, could you imagine opening Christmas presents? And then you just are like, you know what, guys, let's stop. We're going to go play a game of baseball. It would be a riot in my house. That's kind of what Jesus does, though, here. And Jesus, just before this, he's actually mentioned a handful of times that he's going to die really quickly after this. He's been telling his disciples this. And now he really brings in some tension into this meal. And he tells them that one of you at the table is going to be the reason that that's going to come to pass. And all the disciples kind of start like pointing fingers. And they're like, "Is it you? Is it you? Is it me?" It's like when I walk into my kids' room and there's marker on the wall. And I'm like, "One of you did this." And they're both like, "Pfft." They point at each other. In reality, one of them did it. The other one also helped them do it. And it's exactly what we see with the disciples here. Judas, we saw this last week. Judas is the one that is ultimately about to betray Jesus, but so will the rest of the disciples. It's actually like meant to be a little bit of a wordplay here. Judas is going to be the ultimate betrayer, but so are the rest. The rest are also about to bail on Jesus when things get really hard. Because you know who was dipping bread with Jesus at that moment? All of them. So you can actually come back next week and see what that's going to do. So here we have Jesus pretty severely disrupting the rhythm of the Passover. Again, not something that you do. And in verse 22, it continues. "And Jesus, as they were eating, he took bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, and he gave it to them, and he said, 'Take, this bread is my body.'" Can you imagine yourself at that meal? Like, put back together the historical context here. That bread actually means something else. You can probably imagine the disciples all going like, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa." That bread actually represents the haste that we had to flee Egypt with. Like, we didn't have time to let our bread rise. That's why we eat this way. And Jesus kind of looks at them and is like, it doesn't mean that anymore. Jesus says, this is my body. This story, kind of the final meal with Jesus and his disciples, is captured 4 times in the Bible. And the Gospel of Luke actually gives us a few more details of the same story and can give us a little bit of a cleaner and more detailed picture here. And in totality, Jesus' words in the Gospel of Luke go like this. He says, hey, this bread is my body. And then Luke adds this part in, and he says, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. So what Jesus has just done is he's taken one of the most important aspects of a Passover meal, something, again, that's been celebrated the same way for over 1,500 years at this point, and he completely changes the meaning of it and applies it to himself. Can you do that? And it gets even more intense. Watch. Continuing in verse 23. And Jesus took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said to them, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Once again, the same thing, celebrated the same way for over 1,000 years. And Jesus says that wine no longer represents the blood of the Lamb, but it represents his blood, which is going to be poured out for many. Is it clicking here what Jesus is doing at a Passover meal? Jesus has actually just identified himself as the new Passover lamb. The Israelites have only looked backwards at this point to the lamb that died so that God would pass over their house. And Jesus has already told us that he's going to die, and now he's kind of starting to tell us why that's going to happen. He tells us his body's going to be broken, his blood is going to be poured out for who? For us. He's telling us why he's doing it, so that God's wrath would pass over us the same way that it passed over the Israelites in Egypt. And within just the next few hours of this story, Jesus is going to be arrested, he's going to be tried, and he's going to be eventually executed, just as he predicted. He's already kind of called his shot at this point. His body is going to be broken. His blood will be spilled, and God's wrath will pass over anyone who claims the blood of Jesus. This is the story of the Bible, and it's leading up to this moment where we as Christians today can actually use belief in Jesus, and then we get to kind of metaphorically paint Jesus' blood over the doorpost of our life. That's what Jesus is pointing at here. It literally matters for us in this very moment. That's what Jesus has been building up to at this point. So let's take this and look into the future a little bit. Why does this actually matter for us today? What does it mean for us today? And I have 2 things about what I just want to say 2 things about what it means for us today. First, I want to explain why we actually do this. And we do it every single week at Fellowship Denver. So this story, the story of Jesus' actions, is why we do it and why it matters. And just like Jesus said, we do this in an act of remembrance that Jesus is the new Passover lamb for us in this moment. And we actually do this because this is what we need most in our lives. God is a good father to us, and he knows this about us. Sometimes I feed my kids food. I make them really good food. My wife and I think we're good cooks. But we make them good food sometimes, and they'll take 2 bites, and they'll kind of it wasn't quite up to their expectations. They think every meal should have a little bit more mac and cheese on the plate. But what they do is they'll look at us and they'll be like, hey, you know what? 2 bites, I'm done. I'm full. That's what they always say. And we always trick them, and we're like, you want ice cream? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, I thought you were full, sucker. But what we have to do is Megan and I actually have to patiently remind our children, hey, no, you are not done eating your food right now. Because we know what happens if they don't eat enough food in that moment. They're going to go into the basement, and they're going to emerge as this 2-headed, bad-attituded monster that's begging for snacks. And it's just a nightmare for everybody at that point. And what's actually happening is that Megan and I know better than our kids what they need in that moment. They may not feel like eating, but we're saying hey, you actually need to do this. It's going to be better for you. And it's the same exact thing for God and us. God is our good Father, and he knows exactly what it is that we need. And what we need is to be constantly and constantly and constantly reminded of the work of Jesus Christ. This is the main reason that church attendance is life-giving. We get to be here. We set aside time every single Sunday to remind ourselves of the work of Jesus. And it doesn't matter whether you're hurting, if you're filled with joy, or you're downright bored in your faith. What this does every single week is it's going to remind us of something, the work that was done for us through Jesus, and it's going to point to something bigger and better and more fulfilling than anything else we can find in our life. Paul in 1 Corinthians, he tells us that the churches, they actually had a history of recreating and doing this meal pretty regularly. He gives some direction on how they should be doing it. And the one thing I want to show you here is how Paul actually talks about this meal. Do we have this text today in 1 Corinthians? Here we go. Great. Here's what Paul says. He says, "For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, he took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, he also took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and you drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.'" You see what Paul's doing here? He's explaining that all of us, every single person who follows Jesus, was once separated from God, and we deserved not to be passed over by God's judgment. But since we have a new Passover lamb in Jesus Christ, just as the lamb's blood gave the Israelites protection and initiated the Exodus, the fleeing away from an evil ruler, Jesus' blood as a new lamb is actually inaugurating a new Exodus at this very moment. And it's one for us, where the evil ruler of death and sin don't need to oppress us anymore in the church. So while the Israelites fled from Egypt, we actually get to flee from death. Jesus knew what he was doing the entire time when he was putting this meal together. And Jesus' death on the cross, when he's willingly going to allow himself to be killed in our place, is what provides that blood. And it's going to pay the price that we needed to pay. So that very story right there is the reason that we celebrate the Lord's Supper each and every week on Sunday. We do it as an act of remembrance. It's one that involves our entire existence, our mind and our body and our soul and our spirit. It's a gift that God has given us, and we should put it deep down inside of us and meditate on it, reflect on it, and we can draw power from it as well through the act of remembrance. And you might have noticed that there's actually a special posture here that Jesus kind of asks his followers and disciples to take when they approach the table. I've mentioned it a few times, and it's one of remembrance. And in this text, this word remember, it actually means that, to meditate, to follow a rhythm, and to actively work. It's an act of remembrance. This is the rhythm of the Christian faith. And I actually think rhythms like this are normal things that are built into the world around us that kind of keep us sane and focused and grounded. Watch how this works. I'm in a book club right now, and we just read this book called The Twilight World. It's a true story. It's one of the wildest stories I've ever read in my life. There's this soldier whose name is Hiro Onada, and he is a Japanese soldier fighting in World War II. And they drop him off on an island in the Philippines, and they say, "You're in charge. You are to occupy this island until we come and relieve you of your duty. Use whatever tactics you need to, but we want you to use guerrilla warfare." So he stays on this island, and the war ends, and people kind of forget about him. He lives on this island for another 29 years with the assumption that World War II is still happening. I go backpacking sometimes, and I feel like I would break. I feel like I'm a good backpacker. I would break at about day 8. This dude is living in one of the harshest places on earth, and he makes it almost 30 years before they can find him and tell him that the war's over. It's truly mind-blowing. And in my book club, we were sitting there reflecting, like, how do you live in the tropical rainforest? Like, you can go see stories about, like, American soldiers in Vietnam and how it kind of broke them through months and months of just being wet. And we were like, how did he do this? How did he actually stay grounded and sane through this entire ordeal that he spent his entire life doing? You know what he did? When he got to that island, he had a high value on his kind of like samurai heritage, and he took his sword with him to this island. And right in the beginning of the book, he takes this sword, and he has a tree that he can hide swords in. But he hides his sword in this tree, and he actually returns to this tree once a year. And he takes his sword out, and he looks at it, he oils it, he takes care of it. And in this moment, it's actually a reminder of why he's on that island. He uses the sword to remind him of what his purpose is, and it's what keeps him focused. So a couple times throughout the story, he's actually using this to pull him back in to the story of his life. And that's exactly what Jesus is giving us with the Lord's Supper. We approach this table, and it's a chance for us to remind ourselves of the work of Jesus. We get to focus on that. Let it show us why we actually come to church, why we follow Jesus. Let it point forward to the joy that we also have. So, a second thing I want to leave you with is the hope that this is also going to point to. I think an interesting thing to consider when you look at the Passover meal and the new meal that Jesus brings, do you see what's missing from this meal? Remember, a Passover has wine, has bread, bitter herbs, and lamb. But only 2 things from that list continue here. We get bread and wine, but the bitter herbs and meat are gone. Why is that? It's because not only does this meal point backwards to the work that Jesus has done for us in this very moment, but it's also actually going to point forward to the victory that Jesus is bringing with his death on a cross. And the work that Jesus is going to do in the next 24 hours is going to point to a future where tears and the necessity of death are no longer relevant to us. You see, that's why they're missing. And we see this in the very closing pages of the Bible. We get a picture of the work that Jesus, or the act that Jesus accomplishes here as well. So in Revelation 21, closing pages of the Bible, we see these words in the book of Revelation. And it says, he, Jesus, is going to wipe away every tear from their eyes. That's the bitter herbs. They no longer apply to us. And death shall be no more. The lamb no longer needed. Neither there should be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. That's why those things don't continue. Because not only did Jesus fix that in the moment, but he's also pointing forward to a world and a life of new creation. Jesus is telling us and promising it in the very last verse of our text today. And Jesus says, truly I say to you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. What Jesus is telling us here is that there is a better feast coming, and he's going to be there in person with us too. And because of his work on the cross and stepping into the wrath that we deserved, we can actually look forward now with joy. It's one on a new earth, one with 0 tears and 0 death. We don't need bitter herbs to remind us of anything, and we don't need to eat lambs to remind us that something had to die, because it's already happened. So today what we do is we get to come together and celebrate. So that's what we're going to do. Let's pray. Father, God, the work that you have done for us, God, it actually takes a lifetime of reflection and remembrance. And you have given us just a small, simple act of eating and drinking as a mechanism to just remember how much you love us and what you have done for us and what we have to look forward to in our lives. And there's more than just years ahead of us, God. So, God, we just ask that you are with us, and let us remember you today with love and appreciation, God, and also just with full hearts. So we ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen.